Welcome everyone to this new policy webinar. We will start soon in 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock and we start our webinar, our Mobilizing Mobility webinar titled For a More Inclusive, Equitable and Accessible Mobility, the Inclusion Toolbox. This webinar has been produced in cooperation with the EU-funded Inclusion Project. I'm Pasquale Cancellara. I'm a Project and Membership Services Manager at Polis, and I will be here today to chair this webinar. This webinar is part of the Mobilizing Mobility webinar series, also known as MOBOP. They have the purpose to turn European transport innovation into local action. Polis is involved in a series, in a big number of European funded projects on research and innovation. And so with this new series of webinars, we want to enhance the exchange of knowledge and to further communicate the project results to everybody. These webinars are public, so everybody is free to attend them. As you can see from this slide, we cover a wide range of topics. We started at the beginning of September, and we will run our webinar series until the end of the year. About this webinar, a few words about this webinar. So as I said, this webinar has been developed in cooperation with the EU-funded inclusion project, which came to an end last September after 3 years of research on the ground in 6 pilot sites across Europe. The inclusion project raised awareness about how transport does not work equally for all type of users, particularly for those who are vulnerable to exclusion, those people living in remote, urban, peri-urban, and rural areas. So this lack of transport options means reduced access to job, to activities, to goods, to services, to job market, and all this has an impact on people's well-being. So during this webinar, we will try to answer to some questions, such as those you see on this slide. First of all, what tools has the inclusion project developed, and what can we learn from its research, 3 years research? What are the project's key recommendations, and what can be transferred to cities, to regions, and transport authorities and providers? What are the business models and solutions for delivering inclusive mobility and leaving no one behind? And finally, also some overarching questions such as, can we achieve a sustainable and inclusive mobility while also keeping it accessible, affordable, and inclusive for all? So we will try to address these questions during this webinar. Before going to our speakers, just a few words about housekeeping rules. So this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be sent to you. We ask you to please keep your microphone muted when you are not speaking, and to use the Q&A box that you can see in your screen to write your questions. So you are free to type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will pick them after the presentations. It would be also nice if you can name the person you are addressing the questions to, so that it's clearer for all of us. You can also engage with us on social media, so you can share your thoughts about the topic, about inclusion, following Polis Network and the Inclusion Twitter account. So our speakers, today we have 4 excellent speakers. We will start with Michele Masnata, who is Project Manager at Algovat and Inclusion Project Coordinator. Welcome, Michele. We will have also Christine Tovas, who is consultant at Rupert Consult. Welcome, Christine. Andrea Lorenzini, public transport and shared mobility services specialist at Memex, Italy. Welcome, Andrea. And finally, but not least, Lydia Sala, innovation engineer at Mosaic Factor in Barcelona, Spain. Welcome, Lydia. I would like to also remind you that the upcoming Mobilizing Mobility webinar will take place next Tuesday on the 27th of October from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and it will be dedicated to vehicle access regulations. So how vehicle access regulation can be more efficient and effective. So these policy webinars are taking place every Tuesday and every Thursday at the same hour. And as I said before, you are free to join them as they are public. I would also like to say that our annual highlight, so the Police Conference, is taking place online this year as well, for this year, sorry. And it will take place from the 30th of November on the 3rd of December 2020 online, and you can find more information on our website. And it will be also the occasion to discuss more about these big topics. But now I would like to go and show you a video animation that has been developed in the inclusion project, because it gives you in a nutshell, it tells you in a nutshell what the project has done in these 3 years visually. So I will share now my my screen with I will share now the video so that we can watch it.
Important is personal mobility for all of us? How important is personal mobility for all of us? To be free to move and access everyday functions such as education, healthcare, employment, and social activities. For many people, however, the current mobility system does not function as it should, which often leaves them with considerably fewer possibilities to engage in society. Inclusion is a 3-year European Union-funded project that
Okay, sorry, I think there is a problem with my screen. I will share it again. I hope you can see it now. And you can hear it as well.
How important is personal mobility for all of us? To be free to move and access everyday functions such as education, healthcare, employment, and social activities. For many people, however, the current mobility system does not function as it should, which often leaves them with considerably fewer possibilities to engage in society. Inclusion is a 3-year European Union-funded project that aims to address the challenges related to the accessibility of public transport in prioritised areas, that is, peripheral, urban and rural areas, where accessibility, inclusive mobility and equity challenges are greatest. Inclusion identified and analysed concepts and solutions that are already applied in European regions and elsewhere, and proposed a range of innovative and transferable solutions to ensure accessible, inclusive and equitable mobility for all, and especially for vulnerable user categories. In some deprived urban neighbourhoods or remote rural areas, having access to an efficient and inclusive public transport system integrated with shared mobility solutions means greater access to employment, educational and social opportunities. Different people can be vulnerable to exclusion for different reasons. This can be due to age, location, income, gender, ethnicity, physical or cognitive impairments, or combinations of these. As a result, there are many different mobility needs and varied solutions for addressing these needs. Inclusion measures were tested on the ground in 6 pilot sites across Europe. In the Cairngorms National Park in remote rural Scotland, a public-private partnership with local bike shops provided a successful and cost-effective mechanism for delivering an e-bike hire scheme, helping young locals access employment and aiding older residents to keep active and healthy. Flanders region in Belgium explored the potential of new app-based technologies for vulnerable user groups, including an app for elderly and disabled users to book a volunteer ride-sharing scheme and enable access to local services. In Florence, local bus lines were redesigned to improve connections with tram and train services for rural commuters and migrants in deprived peripheral areas. In the Rhine-Sieg district in Germany, the increase in afternoon bus frequencies and the reduction of single bus fares resulted in 5 times more trips of parents accompanying their children to primary school. In Budapest, the transport staff was trained to increase their competency in recognising and assisting vulnerable users. A crowdsourcing platform was designed to collect feedback and opinions by the users on transport services. The Barcelona pilot improved access to social and cultural events for young people, thanks to the provision of 11 new commercially viable collective bus routes from peri-urban and rural areas. This improved access to around 450 young adults and teenagers. Learn what steps your city, region or organisation can take for a more inclusive mobility. Find useful resources, tools and solutions at www.h2020-inclusion.eu.
Okay, perfect. This was in a nutshell, a video animation showing what inclusion has done, and you can find it also on the inclusion website. I would like now to give the floor to Michele Masnata, who, as I said, is a project manager at Algovat Research and Innovation Unit in charge of transport and mobility solutions. And within inclusion, Michele was the project coordinator and leader of the activities focused on ICT-enabled social innovation as well. So Michele will give us a short presentation on the project. Please, Michele. We cannot hear you, Michele. It seems that you are unmuted, but we cannot hear you.
You hear me?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, okay. My headphones were not working. Thank you, and sorry for the inconvenience. I would like to thank Polis for inviting us to this very interesting series of webinars, and thank you all from my side to join today. I would like to give a very quick overview of the project activities. We have already seen from the video which are the basic objectives of the project. To find transferable solutions to improve accessibility and inclusiveness of collective transport, addressing vulnerable users who are most exposed to lack of inclusive transport. In maybe urban and rural areas with a focus on the most deprived and remote areas. The following is a diagram showing the organization of work, I mean, which are the activities and their connections carried out to address these objectives. First, the project analyzed the prioritized areas and user groups with an analysis of the in terms of demographic, socioeconomic and behavioral segments most exposed to the lack of inclusive transport. And this was the background and for all following activities. In terms of innovation, the research activities were conducted with 2 groups of studies, starting from the findings of the first analysis. We first tried to investigate the potential of a combination of ICT and social innovation to design new innovative solutions to address the needs and priorities identified. And the second group of activities was the conduction of 51 case studies, basically to find how other experiences, how other projects addressed the same needs and priorities for inclusive transport. They identified innovation, then the most interesting and promising innovation were implemented in 6 pilot labs. And there will be a specific presentation about that afterwards. The pilot labs then conducted a number of experiments with the implementation of some 15 measures in total. It was a very interesting set of experiments conducted by the service providers and involved in the project. And the findings of the pilot labs were then validated through a process validation, which aimed at identifying basically the processing the stories behind the figures. So by analyzing the lessons learned, the difficulties, how the operations have been carried out, the barriers, obstacles, opportunities, and so on. And also by means of an impact evaluation, where the findings were analyzed and the results were captured and processed, assessed through a number of KPIs to identify the concrete impacts achieved. A number of business models were also defined to find new ways of making the identified solutions financially viable. And the findings of the validation, together with the business models and key findings of other project activities, altogether forced then the conclusions, which basically focused on recommendations on transferability of the identified solutions. Short mention on the consortium. The consortium was composed by 4 industrial partners, a number of transport providers, police and EMTA as associations and for networking. We also had the involvement of a stakeholder forum, which is basically an advisory board with 17 members who provided very useful support to make the impacts, to maximize the impacts. So that was a very quick presentation of our project. You will find more insights in the following presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michele, for this interesting introduction about the project. I will now give the floor to Christine Tovas, who is, as I said, consultant at Ruprecht Consulting Cologne, Germany. And within inclusion, Christine was responsible for process evaluation, research, and analysis of inclusive mobility solutions. And Christine's presentation will be focusing on principles and tools to make transport system fairer for all type of users. So Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pasquale. You can still hear me, but you probably can't see me because my computer just ran into technical issues. So what I would suggest is I'm going to work on that and restart my computer. And if the next presentation would already like to start so we don't waste any time waiting for me.
Okay, if you want, we can...
Sorry about this.
No problem, no problem. We can move then to Steve if you want, or?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Yeah, so let's move to Steve Wright while Christine will adjust these technical issues. So Steve Wright is a research fellow in the Center for Transport Research at the University of Aberdeen, where he focuses on suburban and rural transport solutions. And Steve has led the evaluation of Pilot Lab's measures and has been involved in the business model development as well. So Steve will give us a presentation on the Pilot Lab fundings and demonstrations. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Pasquale. Afternoon, everybody. So this is just an introductory slide, but you've seen this already. But the main inclusion project objective that went across all of the Pilot Lab demonstrations was to ensure accessible, inclusive and equitable conditions for all, and especially vulnerable user categories. And this was demonstrated through these 10 Pilot Lab demonstrations in a variety of different transport environments, socioeconomic contexts, and geographical conditions, including rural areas, remote urban areas, and deprived urban areas. In terms of vulnerable users, the project identified 13 different types of target users who were deemed to be vulnerable. So these users could be vulnerable to exclusion due to 3 main reasons, which you can see illustrated in this Venn diagram. So firstly, they could be vulnerable to exclusion from mobility services due to impairments or communication barriers. They could be vulnerable to exclusion from accessing services and activities due to a lack of affordability of transport options, or they could be vulnerable to exclusion from accessing services and activities simply due to a lack of available transport options or available safe transport options. And you can see illustrated in the Venn diagram that these different types of users can fall into more than one of these categories. And some of them actually fall into all 3. So it can be quite complex finding solutions for those types of users. So I'll just give you a whistle-stop tour of the actual Pilot Lab demonstrations with some of the main findings. Starting in Budapest, the first measure introduced there was staff awareness training to the public transport staff so that they can better understand the needs and the capabilities of their vulnerable users, so that they can then provide more appropriate assistance and have a better attitude and behaviour towards those users. The target users were blind and visually impaired, disabled people, travellers with luggage or baby buggies, and tourists or non-native language speakers. I mean, the main finding from this was that the improved staff attitudes towards the vulnerable users helped to remove confidence barriers that those users faced, which were preventing them from using public transport services. And we found that there was around about a 20% improvement in staff competency levels through the impact evaluation in terms of being able to assist vulnerable users. There was also a 20% increase in satisfaction from those vulnerable target groups with their experiences of using public transport services. And then a second measure, which went hand in hand with the first, was the development of an online crowdsourcing platform. So it's a web page and an app, which allowed users to provide feedback on their experiences and issues they might face when using public transport. This was basically an extension of an existing service, which was allowing users of public utilities to report issues and problems, but it was extended to have a specific application for public transport. So the increase in number of actual recorded incidents went from 5 per month up to 14 per month on average. And we found that almost half of these reported issues were quick and relatively cheap to solve and respond to. And those have been actually addressed by the transport operator in Budapest already. So quite successful in that regard. I have to move on quite quickly because I've only got 10 minutes, but the next pilot lab was the Barcelona pilot lab. And this was looking at improving access to social and cultural events for mainly young people, particularly young females. And they did this by analysing social media data from Twitter about the latent demand to access the Canet Rock Music Festival, which is held annually on the suburbs of Barcelona. And from that information from Twitter, they were able to better identify and plan where commercially viable collective bus services could be delivered from less densely populated peri-urban and rural areas. And I think the video captured some of the main findings from that. Almost 500 new users were given access to the festival from these more remote areas. Most of them were young. Of the under 18s, 60% odd wouldn't have been able to get to the festival without the new service. And those that could relied on lifts from mainly parents. 84% of those that used the buses were female. The next pilot lab is the very rural Cairngorm National Park in Scotland, where a public-private partnership was established with local bike shops in 3 towns in the area to deliver e-bike services. And the bike shops basically use their premises and their existing staff to manage the service and to maintain the bikes, which was a very important part of this. But not only that, having those local shops in the community meant they could act as local champions in helping promote the service and build partnerships with other organisations in the community. And the results were that it enabled more of the active older population to use the service for health and leisure purposes. 30-odd% of the users were over 60 years old. But they also established partnerships with health providers in the area who were referring their patients to use the e-bike service to help them recover from things like hip operations, or for those that had respiratory conditions to maintain their fitness. Additionally, younger people were benefiting from the e-bikes for using them to access employment where they didn't have alternative transport options. In Florence, there were 2 locations where the main objective was redesigning local bus lines to provide better connections to the tram and train services. So in one of the areas, the target users were migrants. It was a deprived, low-income area, peri-urban nature. And then the other, it was a rural area where connections to the train service for commuters was the focus. For the area of the migrant focus, 84% more trips were made by migrants as a result of the measures introduced, and half of those involved the connection to the tram. Alongside the design of, or the redesign of the bus services, with the provision of better or enhanced information that is tailored to the particular target groups. And this was key in getting the communication to those groups and also providing better information about connection opportunities and so on. In Flanders, in Belgium, 2 measures were introduced that had a technology focus. The first one was the delivery of the MobiTwin app. And this was an app developed to try and make the booking of volunteer car service trips more convenient and responsive for the users of those services. And the second one was the enhancement of an existing MAS app called the Olympus app. But with the target group being migrants, a personal mobility budget was built into the use of the app for those users. And also the information content was simplified so that it was more understandable by non-native language speakers. Key findings from this was that extra one-to-one support, training and encouragement to become confident to use the technology was necessary. And also that co-creation at the design stage was really essential if these technologies were going to be usable by those target groups. And then finally, in the Rhine-Sieg area or district of southern Germany, this is an area 30 odd kilometers from Cologne. The idea there was to improve access to public transport, mainly for families and teenagers. So this was introduced in a fairly new housing development where families are moving to outside of the cities. But the opportunities for travel, if you weren't a commuter, were fairly limited outside of peak times. So the main measure introduced here was increasing the frequency of the bus service in the afternoon to target school trips and after school activities. And alongside that, a reduction in single bus fares was introduced. And this had the effect of increasing the number of trips to primary schools for children accompanied by their parent by 400%, but also increasing unaccompanied children traveling by public transport once a week by 40%. So these are the older children and teenagers using buses mainly after school. And then a final measure introduced also in Rhine-Sieg was the better promotion of cycling through the development of a tailored cycling mobility map, which included information about facilities for cyclists, safe routes for cycling, including forgotten paths, so routes which have been renovated, let's say, for cycle use, and then delivering that to every resident within the new housing development. Alongside that, a very small-scale trial of an e-bike service was introduced, and the impact was a 5% increase in cycling trips in the area. So getting to the kind of main conclusions, from the design sort of stages, the most successful solutions are those where extensive demand analysis or user requirements work is undertaken, and where co-design formed a key element of the process. It's important to also know that the public sector has quite a prominent role to play. This can be through financing of the services, but also through monitoring and assuring quality and safety. And it's encouraged to try to have some sort of cross-sectoral partnership planning between public sector departments for coordinating delivery of services and also securing coordinated funding to help pay for them. Sorry, just going to the delivery side.
Steve, you have 1 more minute.
That's fine, thanks. Building partnerships and providing one-to-one support were essential for increasing user awareness, confidence and capability to use services, leading to greater uptake. And really where technology is involved, it's really essential to include vulnerable users in the co-design of these technology tools from the very start. So that was very quick and brief sort of overview of the pilot labs and their main findings, but you'll find more in-depth results related to this and to the evaluation in the documents available on the website. And that's just the front cover from the evaluation focused report. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand back to Pasquale. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this interesting presentation on the pilot labs. Yes, you can stop sharing your screen. Yeah. And Christine Tovas can share her screen now and give a presentation on principles and tools to make our transport system fairer for all. Christine, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Pasquale. I believe that Steve has to stop sharing his screen first. Ah, yes, here we go. Okay. So, give this another try. Okay, great. So thanks, Pasquale. So what can local authorities in cities and regions do to make inclusive mobility a reality so that we can leave no one behind? Well, to answer this question, we first need to understand people's different mobility needs before we can respond to them with effective solutions. So this would be, in a sense, our first step. But to illustrate the importance of this step, on the left, I think we can all agree that by giving everyone exactly the same thing, it doesn't benefit everyone equally. Whereas on the right, we see that different people have different needs, abilities, and resources. And if we use our resources wisely, then we can level the playing field so that everyone is included. So to take it up as a transport metaphor, on the left, we could imagine a standard public transport system built for a typical working age commuter without any disabilities. And other users' needs there are not sufficiently met, which prevents them from fully taking advantage of the public transport system to reach jobs, education, health services, and leisure activities. Whereas on the right, we could imagine a transport system that responds to each user's needs. For example, through affordable ticketing options, sufficient lighting and security, and audio and tactile information, just to name a few examples. So who are we talking about when we say that different people have different needs? Well, in inclusion, we identified 12 user groups who are vulnerable to transport exclusion. And to better understand their needs, which you see listed here, we analyzed 51 case studies on good practice inclusive mobility solutions. And these covered the 3 prioritized area types that we focused on, which was rural and remote, peri-urban, and deprived urban areas. And then we analyzed the patterns and the success factors across these cases. So the next step or question for us would be, what building blocks can we use to understand and respond to all users' needs? So based on this analysis, we have developed the 8 principles for a fairer transport system. And these can be conceptualized as sort of the keys to success, which are meant to help us to better understand vulnerable users' mobility challenges and needs, and to inspire effective solutions that respond to those needs. So the 4 that you see on the right are more sort of the traditional features of an accessible transport system. So accessibility, affordability, convenience, and efficiency. They're related to things such as ticketing and timetables, while the 4 on the left focus more on the human dimension and the subjective experiences of people while using the transport system. But all of these are equally important because they can either inhibit or enable people in their daily mobility. So just to give a little overview on the 8 principles and what they look like in a transport system, when we speak about accessibility, we're talking about that a transport system would be physically, sensorially, and linguistically accessible. So it's not just the traditional sort of low floor vehicles, ramps, elevators, and tactile pavement, but also linguistically. So symbols could be used, or pictograms that could speak to everyone. Everybody could readily understand them if they don't speak the local language, or if they can't read yet, like if it's a child also trying to navigate. And also offering information in different languages as well. Affordability relates to transport services that are affordable for all users relative to their income. So that one is pretty self-explanatory. Convenience refers to the time and or the effort required for vulnerable users to reach a transport service. So this is the first and the last mile. And the aim would be to reduce the effort that's required for them to reach these services. Efficiency refers to once the vulnerable users are on board a vehicle, the time or the effort required to use the service. So for example, longer journey times and changing vehicles multiple times would be minimized insofar as it's possible. Now moving on to the human dimension and the subjective experiences of people while using the transport system. An empowering transport system has mobility solutions that build vulnerable users' capacities to get around confidently. So this could manifest in training courses for them, or travel buddies to help guide them through the transport system so that they have this sort of sense of confidence and security in getting around on their own, and they feel empowered. Empathetic solutions involve empathy building initiatives that foster awareness and build the capacities of transport staff as well as the general public so that they're more ready and willing to help in case these people need assistance. So it's sort of a helping hand type solution. Gender equitable mobility services enable all users, regardless of gender identity or orientation, to have access to transport services that meet their daily needs. And this focuses mostly on facilitating intermodality, accessibility, and especially safety. And lastly, we get to sort of the cross-cutting theme of safety. So mobility services that increase the perceived or actual safety. And this is a really key distinction because we may think that we're developing transport services that everyone should feel safe in and they're adequate, but maybe some people don't because certain things are missing, like adequate lighting, or there's low visibility, they feel sort of isolated. Others can't see them or what might be happening there, or maybe it's very noisy. So these are both equally important as well. So with these 8 principles in mind, we can qualitatively assess vulnerable users' needs and the types of solutions we should prioritize to respond to those needs. So here we have examples from 3 different user groups. And as you can see, the mobility barriers they face are very different. So we could imagine, of course, though, that many people fall into multiple categories at once. So we can easily imagine that across Europe and beyond, there are many people who would be elderly, living in a rural or remote area and having a low income. So that's why when applying the 8 principles, we need to continuously try to understand and respond to users' unique sets of needs. So when applying these 8 principles, you could sort of see them as a step-by-step or at least a checklist of what you can do. So the first would be to start with the people and make an extra effort to reach vulnerable users right from the design phase, because this will be really well worth it in the end. And especially because most of the people working in transport in the public and private sectors are not part of these vulnerable groups themselves, and so may not be aware of the daily details and the issues they may be encountering in the transport service. It's also important to recognize compounded needs. So many users are, as I mentioned, associated with more than one of the 12 user categories that we've identified. And consequently, they're even more affected. So without this perspective, we risk seeing users as a homogeneous group and creating policies and implementing measures that are assumed to benefit them all, but which mostly just work for some. It's also important to give them a voice. So solutions that are developed by vulnerable users for vulnerable users are almost guaranteed to respond directly to their particular needs. And user associations and members of the community who represent the vulnerable user groups can also act as gatekeepers to these typically hard to reach groups. So that is another avenue that you could look into to give these users a voice. It's also important to build and maintain trust. So maintaining direct two-way communication with users throughout the process of developing inclusive mobility solutions will ensure that these people want to participate in the future, and also it acts as sort of a feedback loop so that they can give feedback and you can adjust the solutions you're developing so that they better meet the needs. And lastly, reach outside of the box. So as we discuss with vulnerable users about their needs and ideas for improving the transport system, we need to think about which other departments, community organizations, or private sector actors that need to be brought into the discussion and maybe partnered with so that we can develop effective and innovative solutions, and so that we can leverage funding for them so that we can extend our range of options. So to conclude, by keeping these recommendations and 8 principles in mind, then we can ensure that inclusive mobility projects work not only technically and financially, but also that they holistically address the target user's various needs and they leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this very interesting presentation on principles and tools to make transport more equal for everybody. I will give now the floor to the joint presentation from Andrea and Livia Sala. They will highlight some business models to deliver affordable and inclusive mobility. So you will be sharing your screen, Andrea. Please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pasquale. So let's start this final presentation about business models for inclusive mobility, guidance for successful implementation. And we will be, it will be me, Livia Sala, together with Andrea, who will present this presentation. So let's start with the first part of the presentation. And firstly, I will go through the methodology we have designed to reach these inclusive business models. So the first step was to identify what was needed. So starting from the user's needs and user's principles that Christine has just previously explained, that were accessible, affordable, convenient, efficient, empowering, empathetic, gender equitable, and safety. These principles were framing the requirements on the demand side. So what we have done was to link them with existing mobility gaps, such as the ones you can see here: vehicle design, ticketing and payment system, information provision, network density and connectivity, frequency of service, intermodality, and reliability of the service, which were gaps that were highlighting what was needed in the supply side to better meet the user needs. And by doing this exercise, what we came up with was a set of 7 inclusivity goals. So for example, by linking the accessibility with the safety and the vehicle design, we got the first inclusivity goal that was about ensuring that the vehicle's design accommodate the user's needs. And like this, we came up with these 7 inclusivity goals. Next slide, please. So the second step was about how do we deliver what was needed. So in the previous slide, we identified the requirements on the demand side and what is needed in the supply side to establish the inclusivity goals. You can see these inclusivity goals on the outer ring of this diagram, but to be able to deliver these services that address the inclusivity goals, it requires also the compatibility with policies priorities of the cities and regions that the vulnerable users live. So for the mobility-related policies, not yet, please, sorry. For the mobility-related policies, these priorities were shaped in the 2nd edition of the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans Guidelines. So in the inner ring of this diagram, you can see the public sector policy and planning priorities. And then in the middle ring, we identified 8 business concepts that provide the link between the policy's priorities and the vulnerable user needs. Also, in the right-hand side of the diagram, you can also see the more integration and more sharing goals that were most relevant to ensuring the social equity and increasing economic viability from the supply side. While in the left-hand side of the diagram, we can see the more choice and more independent travel that were more relevant to enhance the accessibility and quality of life of the demand side. Now, yes, next slide. And finally, based on these business concepts, we developed 14 business scenarios and models. And today I will briefly explain and introduce one of them. So I will be focused on the big data analysis to better identify where demand for transport services exists, to be able to offer commercially viable collective transport services that better meet vulnerable user needs. And this was the Barcelona experience. So what was the problem in Barcelona? As Steve was previously mentioned, we had here an occasional group of travelers, particularly young people and women that were moving as individual or small groups to common destinations such as music festivals. And when there was limited public transportation, these target users are used to either taking their own car or directly not going to the festival. The prioritized areas where we focused this demonstration was one that we had different municipalities where they had limited public transport accessible to access to this event. And this was because the public transport was inflexible or infrequent during nighttime, or also it was because the public transport infrastructure is operated on a radial routes, structures linking the peripheries and Barcelona, but the Canet Rock Festival was placed in the suburban areas of Barcelona. And also the vulnerable users that we targeted in this experience were, as Steve said, mainly youngsters under 24 years old and also females, women. So what we did here was, our goal was to reduce the territorial accessibility barriers to attend to Canet Rock, this event that was located in a peri-urban area in the north of Barcelona. So we implemented here two different measures. The first one was about identifying potential users' demand that wanted to attend to this event through social networks analysis. But we also wanted to identify the potential geographical areas to propose the most suitable bus stops locations for this uncovered demand. The actors involved in this demonstration was Mosaic Factor, the ICT service provider, Bus Up, the on-demand service provider, the event organizer, and also different local bus providers. So what we delivered was a set of potential bus stops locations for Bus Up to deliver this service, on-demand service. Okay. To develop the inclusive business models, the solutions have been analyzed.
Lydia, just to say that to please go to your conclusions, because we will only have 10 minutes until the end of the webinar, so that we can leave at least 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I'm just finalizing. So to develop these inclusive business models, the solutions were analyzed from a perspective of the overall stakeholders interested in delivering the solution, not by a single actor. So we go through all the challenges and opportunities of each of the actors involved in each of the business models. And next slide, please. And finally, this is an example of one of the 14 business models we delivered for the project. And just to say that these kind of business models, we cover different inclusive perspectives, such as the vulnerable demographic barriers, social demographic barriers, mobility gaps, social innovation, or inclusion principles. So Andrea, you can continue. Sorry for the time.
Yeah, no problem at all. So just moving ahead with the business model, what Inclusion tried to do was to select the most promising business model for supporting effective mobility solution for vulnerable users in prioritized areas. And at the end of the process that was just shared by Lydia before, we finally identified 5 different business models, not-for-profit community services in rural areas led by the public sector, asset sharing in rural peri-urban areas where there is a public-private partnership, peer-to-peer ride-sharing services with the direct involvement of the community, new form of subsidized travel through mass system, and big data analysis merged with commercially viable collective transport service. So for each of these selected business model, we try to analyze the key characteristics and also to develop what we call the key recommendation for transferability of this. And I'm gonna just share with you an example of what we call peer-to-peer ride-sharing services. And that include both carpooling, where user can share their private car with the other user that has to do to reach the same destination at the same time, but also lift giving schemes, where the drivers with their own vehicle lift to certain user, sometimes free or sometimes with small reimbursement. And we also tried to identify what were the key characteristics for successful implementation of each of them. And just to mention a couple of them, it is important to raise the point that our solution that are aimed to increase the coverage for non-essential trip at low cost, also to increase integration to the core transport network, and have a huge potential to be implemented especially in peri-urban and rural remote areas. It is a model where a solution where the social motivation plays an important role or a fundamental role. And that's why it's important that there is a stakeholder that acts as a leader. There is the engagement of local sponsor and ambassador to promote it. But we also identified that the technology can or sometimes not be so crucial for the operation of this, because thinking about the social motivation, there are some vulnerable users such as the elderly that prefer to phone the travel dispatch center or things like that. So we need to be careful about this. Just, I don't want to enter into the recommendation of each business model, but rather try to share with you what are the key findings from these activities. And we try to produce a sort of guideline for each of the 3 different actors that we address it. So in terms of the public sector, as also mentioned by Steve before, it's clear that the public sector has a crucial role to play for the improvement of the accessibility and inclusiveness of the transport system in European prioritized areas. There are opportunities that can be achieved in short time, especially for facilitating an independent travel for vulnerable users. And here I put in this presentation just a couple of initiatives that could be activated by the public, such as, for example, filling in the mobility gaps in rural peri-urban areas by supporting development of asset sharing scheme, or, for example, encouraging the development of ride sharing and community-based transport service. And what is important is that the public sector has to act sometimes also for adapting the regulatory and legislative framework for the development of particular kind of solution. For example, when they are promoting not-for-profit collective transport services in rural areas. Moving very fast to the other stakeholders that we try to address, the private sector has to be engaged for the delivery of inclusive mobility solution. And that's why we try also to address 3 other categories, such as on-demand and private service provider, the public transport service provider, and the technology provider. And each of them can be important for the improvement of accessibility of European prioritized area. For example, the use of social media for understanding where there is a latent demand and for the provision of collective transport services can be a solution that can be developed with a multi-stakeholder approach, where there is the ICT provider that applies social media technique, and also the on-demand service or private service provider that provide the service. And
Andrea, if we can please go to conclusion, because we have 4 minutes until 3 o'clock.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sorry. And yeah, my last slide, sorry, I promise. And just to say that also the community has to be engaged also in that. We just put here some opportunities that can be activated, especially for rural and remote areas. And with talking about people, it's clear that inclusion try to empower them. So to reduce, for example, the need for car ownership, to give them more transport option, and to give them the ability to reach more destinations, for example, ride sharing service. And finally, there is a publication that is coming soon, this business model for inclusive mobility. So please have a look at it for further information, because time is end. So thanks, Pasquale, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you, everybody, for very interesting presentation. I understand that there are so many things to say about the project, but unfortunately, we only have 1 hour. And we only have 3 minutes until the end of this webinar. I see that there are no questions and answers in the box. So I have a question actually to all of you. Let's see if we can be briefly 1 second, 1 minute per speaker, if it's possible. Yeah, basically it's what we already what we emerged during this discussion is that all this comes, ensuring inclusive mobility comes at a cost, of course, because to make sure that everybody benefits from inclusive transport solutions, then this comes at a cost as well. But we tend to see inclusion in transport as a nice thing to have, whereas this is a paramount, is very important, because this leaves people behind, people with less possibility to engage in society. So basically, what does it take to turn this into a priority, into policy priority? And how do you see here the role of the European Union? Or is this more like a local thing? So like something that the local players should do. Do you see also a role of at the EU level or not? If you can comment in in briefly, please. I don't know, would you like to start, Christine?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. Thanks, Pasquale. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think as you say, inclusion in transport is often looked at as a nice thing to have because sort of there's a misconception that it's very costly to implement inclusive mobility measures and that those solutions only benefit a small portion of the population. But in fact, it's more about taking a universal design approach to designing transport services, which means they'll have benefits for everyone at different points in their lives as we age and our needs change. So I think it's more about reframing it as an issue of universal design, which can reveal a lot of synergistic measures, which can be very cost effective and ultimately attract more people to use sustainable modes. And of course, I think the Commission's role in this would be to promote universal design and co-creation, specifically with vulnerable users, and to support cities through this process. Also by prioritizing it in future calls for proposals and policy documents. So.
Thank you, Christine. Does anyone would like to add something?
Yeah, if I may step in, Pasquale, just very shortly. I fully agree with what Christine just said. I want just to add the fact that probably it is also a matter of what we can call sort of transport justice or inequality or equity in transport, as Christine also presented. I mean, if we think about how the local authorities are currently spending their budget, and no matter that there is a good rationale for that, but probably it is also time to rethink about how the current transport system is designed, especially for giving the possibility to all to access transportation services. And I mean, we are not dealing with just vulnerable users, but all of what we call poorly served users. So that's why we try also to develop this business model also to think about how to improve the mobility offering priorities such as rural and remote. So I wanted just to add this.
A changing paradigm, yes. Thank you. Does Steve or Michele would like to add something, or Lydia?
Yeah, I fully agree with the concept of universal design for vehicles and services, but I think when it comes to legislation, I think there has to be a recognition that rural areas are very different in characteristic compared to urban areas. And where anti-competition legislation works in urban areas, it actually creates unnecessary barriers to delivering solutions in rural areas. So I think when it comes to legislation in different types of prioritized area, it shouldn't be universal. There should be tailored legislation according to the characteristics of those areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Michele, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I agree with Steve. Exactly. In rural areas, there are many difficulties in terms of legislations, and very often we see that in cities, inclusive transport is already part of the guidelines of the interventions, but not in rural areas. So we have seen in a few of our pilot sites that, for example, public-private partnerships are a very effective way of implementing new solutions that could fill the gaps. But this requires interventions at the legislative level. And so in that respect, for sure, the European Union can, enforce the directives so that they are fully adopted by smaller communities.
Thank you, Michele.
Just
Lydia?
one final remark. Yeah, I agree that sometimes we need public institutions for helping us with these costly mobility solutions in some of the private or areas. But we have also seen experiences in inclusion, such as in the Barcelona experience, where technology can help us to convert commercially viable services, like the case of Bus Up with technology. So sometimes we can use these kind of technologies to better address these isolated cases in rural areas.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you all. And it's true also, we see also an increasing interest also from the Commission towards rural areas in these past few years, and the transport challenges there as well. Okay, so we are 4 minutes behind the schedule, so I have to close this webinar. It was very interesting to have all of you here. I would like to remind to everybody, to people who are listening to us, that they can visit the inclusion website and where they can find all types of resources here. On the website is h2020-inclusion.eu. So you can navigate, you can find all the publications that are available, as the project has ended, as I said, last month. And finally, I would like to remind all of you that the next Polis webinar will take place next Tuesday on the 27th of October, and it will be discussing the vehicle access regulation in cities. Thank you very much to the speakers, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.